Hello, welcome back to the David Watson podcast. Today I'm speaking with Tom, and Tom has written several books about who really pioneered the change in college football in America. The pioneers who actually made a difference, and where the myths are, and why that happened. Hello, welcome to the David Watson podcast. How are you doing?
Hey, thanks for having me on and this chance to tell many of the untold stories about college football integration. American college football lore has gotten it all wrong. They're not crediting the right people, and that's the reaction I get from people who read my book and welcome the chance to expand my audience.
So explain for people in the United Kingdom, because the only thing we really know a little bit about, unless you're an avid football fan, is the NFL. So what is college? Because is college football? Actually, I'm not going to say anything because I haven't got a clue what college football is really.
Yeah. Well, what happened with college football was actually more popular than the NFL in the early 1960s. The NFL didn't really take off until the mid 60s and into the 70s. So, anyways, you had the before the Super Bowl. Um, the most popular sport was college football, and the most popular game was the Army Navy game every year. That was pretty much the Super Bowl for American football. And then when Michigan State played Notre Dame in what was called the 1966 game of the century, this was before the first Super Bowl, and it was a record TV audience of 33 million. And Terry Hanratty of the Pittsburgh Steelers, he was the Notre Dame quarterback, and he said that the drama around the Michigan State Notre Dame game was bigger than the two Super Bowls he played in because the Super Bowl was still growing when he played in the 70s. But anyways, the point I'm getting to is college football was more popular than the NFL, but college football we had segregation in the South. So the top teams in the South didn't have any black players. This is the part that most people Americans don't understand. In the rest of the country, you had integrated teams, but there was an unwritten quota that teams didn't want more than a half dozen black players. And this played out in the Michigan State Notre Dame game of the century. Because Duffy Daugherty, Michigan State's coach, College Football Hall of Fame, he was the first coach to ignore the quota limitations. So here you had a record TV audience of 33 million, and they watch Michigan State versus Notre Dame, these two Goliaths playing for a quasi national championship in November 19th, 1966. And Michigan State lined up 20 black players, 11 black starters, two black team captains, College Football Hall of Famers George Webster and Clinton Jones, and the South's first black quarterback to win a national title, Jimmy Raye of Fayetteville, North Carolina, which was still segregated in those days. And at that time, Jimmy Raye was one of only two black quarterbacks in major college football. On the other side of the line, you had Notre Dame, and they had one black player, Alan Page. If you can imagine American sports today, national power team with only one black athlete. That's the way it was back then, and it was because of the unwritten quota. Well, Michigan State was traveling this parallel track with Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, of course, was well documented in our media, but the sports media avoided talking about race because they didn't want to alienate their readers and subscribers. So these milestones were taking place, but they weren't being properly recorded. That kind of changed with the Michigan State Notre Dame game with 33 million people watching. Although, if you read the newspaper and magazine accounts, there's no mention of race, and that this was a transformative moment. But everybody saw what was happening, and eventually, like I said, this parallel track, things were changing in the South, and the rest of the country and the coaches, of course, are copycats. They saw that Michigan State's locker room, Michigan State had proven you can have black and white players in the same locker room beyond a half dozen black players, and you can have black white players following the leadership of Jimmy Raye, a black quarterback, and George Webster and Jones as team captains, and George Webster as a linebacker. A linebacker is like a quarterback in to the offense to the defense. So Michigan State flipped everything upside down.
I'm trying to, because we have, I vaguely remember there was a manager called Ron Atkinson in the UK who was, I think, the first person to, I think he had 3 black players. But my history on that is vague. We kind of never had a civil rights movement or anything like that. So um, we our politics around this and our history around this are extremely different to the United States. That's not that racism didn't exist and it didn't have its own issues, but very similar to United States. There was a big problem with the English and the Irish. I remember this particularly well because my mum was Irish and my dad was English, and which left at a time what was nicknamed or referred to as the Troubles, which was the violence in Northern
Right.
Ireland, which
Right.
and of course married to my dad was a British soldier married to a Southern Catholic, Irish Catholic woman. So the politics of that was quite deep in my house, and
Yeah.
these things are complicated, and it's always difficult. I remember going to school, and there was a point that I'm saying this is I remember going to school and they were teaching the history of Northern Ireland, and I'm sat there just like that's not true. That's not true. That never
Yeah.
happened. And the teacher's like, look, blah blah, and it's like, hang on a second. My dad was there in the 70s. My dad is married to an Irish flick from Germany. I have a great uncle who was part of the army that was involved. The original IRA. Do you know what I mean? My whole family is encapsulated in this. My grandfather, who was born in Dublin, left Ireland and joined the British Army to fight in the Second World War. So it's do you know what I mean? It's complex and so woven together that when people would say, well, what's the problem? It's like, shit, I don't even know where to start. Because sometimes I don't think even people realize what the problem was.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or sometimes they
Well,
didn't even know it was a problem.
right.
Yeah.
Well, what happened? What happened in America with college football? And this story that I tell in my books, "Ray of Light" and "The Right Thing to Do," is because the media stayed away from race. These stereotypes that white athletes wouldn't follow black athletes, or that there would be conflict in the locker room, continued. And so, because this wasn't documented properly, we have a coach in America, a legendary coach named Bear Bryant at the University of Alabama, and he dragged his feet on segregation until 1970. And he's the I don't know. I'm not sure who the football English football coach is to compare it to, but I'll say he was like the Vince Lombardi of the NFL. And so nobody the myth that grew was that he led college football integration in the South. The reality was he was dragging his feet. He was the seventh of 10 coaches in the Southeastern Conference, the premier conference in the South, to recruit his first black player in 1970. And by then, 33 of the 37 major Southern programs had moved on because of the civil rights movement. They had their first black player. But because America understood so little about what was happening in the 60s and the incremental steps down the timeline of college football integration. These myths were made up in the 1990s that Bear Bryant led the way when he invited USC to come to Birmingham, Alabama in 1970, and that he scheduled the game as one to lose so that he could shock his bigoted fans uh, into allowing him to recruit black players once they saw USC black stars run over Alabama. And it's pure baloney. There were all kinds of black stars throughout the 1960s in America. But people love to grab onto a myth, especially when it's about a mythical figure.
Yeah.
And my point is, not only is it not true, it's an injustice to the true pioneers who cleared the path because these original black guys in the South, they had to face the Ku Klux Klan and death threats and retaliation. It was not an easy road, but that's what this myth wants you to believe, that all Bear Bryant had to do was wave a wand and trick his bigoted fans into allowing to recruit black athletes. But just think about the entire premise. Your greatest coach in England scheduling a game to lose. It's preposterous,
Yeah.
but it worked. It worked. People believe it.
Should I just change in direction slightly? When did you first realize you were a fan of football?
Well, I was always a fan of football. I always loved all sports. The way I got onto this story and the way I know more about it than most writers um, is when I was in elementary school. My father was a professor, college professor, and we moved to a small town in Michigan called Big Rapids, Michigan. He was a professor at Ferris State University, and my family was always liberal and supported the civil rights movement. So I was always aware of that was my mindset in our family. So when we'd watch the games, and like I said, keep in mind this wasn't being reported and tallied up in the media, but you could watch the game, and I knew there was something different about the Michigan State players, even as an elementary school kid, that they had more black players than the other schools, and most significantly that they had a black quarterback, Jimmy Raye. Now, when you're in elementary school, you can't intellectualize that. And I went through I always wanted to be a writer. I always loved sports, always loved history, always wanted to be a writer. So I went through my newspaper career, and as it was starting to wind down, I realized this story about Michigan State and Duffy Daugherty leading college football integration had never been properly told. And fortunately, well, I was living in San Diego, working for the San Diego Union Tribune at the time, and Jimmy Raye's son was a vice president for the San Diego Chargers. They're now the Los Angeles Chargers. And so I got to know him, and I asked him to hook me up with his dad, told him my idea, and his dad was was liked the idea as well as the Michigan State players that were still alive and with us, and so they were very cooperative. And then I came up with a story that was much deeper than I expected, and even more deep. And the best compliment I get was from the many black players and white players that they didn't know these things that I uncovered and put
Yeah.
together in my books.
So
And that goes back to the failure. I want to make one more point. That goes back to the failure of the 1960s sports media to document properly what was going on, the incremental baby steps, and on the other side of the coin, the failure of the modern media to continue to perpetuate this Bear Bryant myth just because he's Bear Bryant. That's the power of hagiography in America. That he's a legend, and nothing tarnishes him.
but what I'm trying to understand is, were you a fan of football first, and this hypocrisy came to light, and you're like, I'm not standing for that because this is the game. This is what I love. Do you know what I mean? Because all of his, I'm a fan of boxing, and I don't watch it anywhere near as much as I can, as I used to. But when I was a kid, I remember the boxers that I remember
Yeah.
Barry McGuigan, I remember Frank Bruner, Don Lloyd Hunnigan going over and to America, and I remember Nigel Benn beating up Evan Barkley and stuff like that. And these people, like, I went off on about the heroes that elevated, but as soon as I said that, I remember Daley Thompson at the 1984 Olympics, and that just like as a kid, this guy was superhuman. He looked like a superhero. It's like that guy's like the superhero. So it was that love that got me interested in anything that went on after that. And that's what I'm trying to. Was it there was a like you were just madly passionate about the sport, and you this was a sport you grew up around. You loved this sport, and then you seen the bullshit, and we're like, I'm not having that. I'm not having that tarnish what is and what became college football and how great that become and the difference it made. Because even though it wasn't reported, I'd say arguably it did a huge amount to shift the consciousness of America.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. I'd say I was a sports fan first as a kid, but like I mentioned a little earlier, because of my family background
Yeah,
and my awareness, it was always a seed in the back of my mind. And as I grew more aware, as I grew more intellectually and read more history
yeah,
and understood what the civil rights movement was about, I kind of put two and two together, which is why I didn't maybe write a book when I was younger. Uh, but yeah, definitely a sports fan first. But what I think separates me from other sports writers is that I always had that seed germinating. And because Michigan State was my favorite team, my favorite school, that was that was the only school I ever wanted to go to. And that
yeah.
once I got admitted, I never even applied to another school. So it was just a combination that it all came together. But yeah, like you say, I was like any other kid. I just loved all the sports,
Well,
not just football, baseball, basketball.
because, and the reason I ask is like I said, I mentioned a couple of names there, but there was a standout one for me when I was a kid growing up, which was Lloyd Hunnigan, and he went over to America and he beat Don Curry, and it was a massive upset. And in my brain, in my memory, I think I saw that live. I couldn't have possibly seen it live. It was in the 80s, and we didn't have a satellite TV. So I couldn't have seen it live. I must have watched it on like some Saturday afternoon sports program. And then the reason I mention that is because a lot of those people, with the exception of Barry McGuigan, who I mentioned earlier, were all black, and they were my heroes growing up. I'd idolize these guys. So when I kind of discovered this thing about racism, like you say, when you're a kid, you don't really you can't intellectualize and articulate really what's going on. You in the capacity of actually understanding somebody just dislikes that person because they're a different color. It's so that kind of understanding or observation of that came much later for me because when I was growing up, all my sports heroes were pretty much black and they were boxers, and I wanted to be all of them.
Yeah, yeah.
Turns out I'm not. I'm pretty easy to hit, and I don't hit hard enough back. So,
Right.
so two major flaws. Um, but so when I became aware that people were racist, it wasn't something that I could kind of get involved in because people that I aspired to be were the athletes of the day in Great Britain, you know. And so it's just like, well, like if anybody knows who Lloyd Hunnigan is, Nigel Benn, Daley Thompson, they're black. And, they're like just talking about them, I smile because of the childhood memories and just how awesome they were. So it's going back to that thing with sports, it's there's an interesting thing that when people are running onto the pitch, there are people in the crowd who just hate people because they're black. But then
Yeah.
there's people in the crowd that don't care because you're wearing the right coloured shirt. and I don't care
Yeah.
where you're from. I don't care what you do. I don't care what your name is. I don't care what color you is. You're wearing my badge, and you
Yeah.
just scored a touchdown. You just threw the ball. You just blocked. You just did whatever, and you're the best guy on the field, and we're winning because of you. So you can come round and you can have dinner on Sunday. What do you know what I mean? But humans are like that. We're strange like that, and
Yeah.
you know, and I wonder how much of that subconsciously transformed the consciousness of America.
It it's been slow and not throughout our society. We keep going. Keep taking a step forward. We elect a black president, Barack Obama, and then we take a step backward because there's always a backlash. There's always a segment of racism in America that feels too much is given to black people freely in the effort to create equality. The programs from the civil rights movement to create equality, opportunity with college education, et cetera. And then you have the various welfare programs.
So, how many books have you written?
Two, and I'm working on a third one. I also have a children's book. So, and they're all the first two are focused on the 65 and 66 teams of Michigan State, which I told you, changed the face of college football because Duffy Daugherty, their coach, was so far ahead on abandoning these unwritten quotas. At the same time, segregation was breaking down in America. So they were because they were national champions, they were able to attract national attention, and that contributed to the snowball effect of other schools and coaches following what Michigan State had done. Uh, that was mostly the 1965 and 66 seasons. I later realized that the story behind Michigan State and Duffy Daugherty, their coach, and what he set in motion in the South was far deeper. And that was my second book, The Right Thing to Do, the true pioneers of college football integration in the 1960s. And these are all the guys, in addition to what Duffy Daugherty did at Michigan State, these are guys like Jerry Levias at Southern Methodist University, which is in Dallas, Texas. Warren McVeigh in Houston, Texas. Bob Grant at Wake Forest in North Carolina. All these guys were the first black players in the 60s in the South that ended segregation at their school because their schools were led by presidents and coaches that wanted to see the end of segregation. And I talk about what they had to deal with. Jerry Levias, when he played at the University of Texas, the preeminent program in the state, the fans were waving nooses at him. Later in the year, when Southern Methodist played at Texas Christian, which is in Fort Worth, right down the street road from Dallas, the FBI determined the death threats against Jerry Levias were real. And so he had escorts to and from the stadium. It was at Texas Christian. They had agents scanning the stadium for a sniper. There were people that believed that he might get shot down right there on the field. The coach gave him the opportunity not to play, but he played. And the joke many years later was none of his teammates would stand next to him on the sideline. But he put it in. So under all that pressure, he had this great game. He returned a punt for a touchdown. These are the real heroes. These are the courageous guys who move the ball forward on college football integration. Not this simplistic story about Bear Bryant, a segregationist coach at Alabama, inviting USC to come to Birmingham, Alabama, schedule the game as one to lose so that he could shock his bigoted fan base into allowing him to recruit black players. There were already plenty of black stars not only throughout American college football, but in the South. B, Bear Bryant had finally signed his first two black players, Bo Matthews and Wilbur Jackson, before that game was even scheduled. The game wasn't scheduled until January 1970. It was played in September 1970. These two guys were signed in December 1969. It's all baloney to perpetuate the myth of Bear Bryant, and it was a successful myth because there was this void, this lack of information in the 1960s. So when these people heard this simplistic story about Bear Bryant, they just nodded their head, accepted it. The American sports media did a terrible job of vetting the story, and it just continues and regurgitates. And as I said, my main point, it's at the expense of the true pioneers.
Why do you think the media haven't done more to point this out?
Anyone who reads my book, they're shocked. They say, "Wow, I didn't know any of this." And I get that a lot from fellow graduates of Michigan State alumni. They say they're so proud of their university, but they didn't really know all this about Duffy Daugherty. The media, for some reason, is just fixated on Bear Bryant as a legend. I've read and I've done a lot of reading about this, and uh, what I've read is people tend to go with what to believe the story they're familiar with,
Mm,
even if they learn later it's not true.
yeah.
And that's what we have. People just don't want to tarnish the image of Bear Bryant.
Who were there any outstanding white players that were sort of promoted their black colleagues, or was there resistance with white players as well?
Oh, there's plenty of resistance. You had Jerry Levias at Southern Methodist, which is in Dallas. He was the only black player on the team, and he said he was an outcast on his campus. Students wouldn't acknowledge him when he walked by him to the classes. He said they only needed me on Saturday, game day,
Mm,
and on the weekends he would go to the black community in Dallas and spend time with people there. Uh, in the games, he was a victim of cheap shots all the time. He had to learn how to, when he got tackled, to bounce back up on his feet so other players didn't pile up on him. So yeah, that's another thing these guys had to deal with that wasn't being written about, and it's just absolutely criminal that Bear Bryant gets the credit over these guys.
of course. What about were there any outstanding or pioneers from the white players who did stand by the side of their teammates?
Yeah, of course. And some of these stories get told. Um, there was a guy named Brian Piccolo who played at Wake Forest, and it was actually a movie's. He died of cancer, of leukemia, when he was a player with the Chicago Bears, and his teammate was Gale Sayers, who was a famous black player from Kansas, and he's in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And Gale Sayers and Brian Piccolo were both running backs, good friends. And there was a movie made about how they were good friends, a black guy and a white guy, and the tragic ending of Brian Piccolo's dying. That's the story most Americans know. But when he was at Wake Forest, and this was before Bob Grant was the first black player at Wake Forest, uh, in 1963, Darrell Hill of Maryland was the first black player at a Southern school. Maryland was then in the Atlantic Coast Conference with Southern schools like Clemson and North Carolina and South Carolina and those schools. So they and Wake Forest. So they played a game at Wake Forest. And here's Wake Forest, a Baptist-based university. It's supposed to be a Christian school, and the fans are booing Darrell Hill for just being black. This is during the warm-ups. Game hasn't even started, and they're booing him. And Brian Piccolo came over, a white guy from New York, although he was playing for Wake Forest, came over to the Maryland side of the field, put his arm around him, and walked him around the stadium to shut up the crowd. But these things would happen when Darrell Hill played at Clemson, which is in South Carolina. The guards, the ticket takers, they wouldn't let his mom into the stadium. And a similar story to that, Michigan State was the first fully integrated team to play in the South in 1964, and in a game at North Carolina. And so the Michigan State's black players were from South Carolina. They knew about these stories, and so they feared. One of them was George Webster. He's in the College Football Hall of Fame and was a Michigan State team captain. He was only a sophomore in 1964, captain in '66. Anyways, George Webster and Jim Summers, both from South Carolina, they both told their parents to stay home because they feared what might happen to them at the game. It turned out that North Carolina was a little ahead of other Southern schools, and Michigan State players said that they didn't have any problems with racism or the N-word being thrown around or cheap shots. So this was a progressive moment, and nothing was written about it in 1964. Yeah. It's basically told for the first time in my book. So yeah, there were constantly examples, but because they weren't reported, and all this got skipped over. Remember, this is 1964 at Michigan State at North Carolina. First time a fully integrated team played the South. But if you listen to the Bear Bryant myths that ESPN, the New York Times, Sports Illustrated, The Athletic, they all perpetuate this myth that Bear Bryant was the first to invite an integrated team to the South, USC, in 1970. And just a few years before that, here's the other thing about that, wrong about that myth. USC, which is Southern California, the University of Southern California, just a few years earlier, USC was one of the schools following the unwritten quota of not having more than a half dozen black players. So USC was hardly a model of integration. By 1970, they were fully integrated, but throughout the 1960s, they were not. They won their 1962 national title with only 5 black players, and their 1967 national title with only 7, led by some guy you might have heard of, O.J. Simpson.
Yeah.
Who was from San Francisco City College. And I mentioned that because Southern California is based in Los Angeles. Diversity, population, and even with a guy from San Francisco City College, you only have 7 black players. You had to work hard at keeping your numbers that low.
Who were the leading colleges around the United States that kind of took the baton and led first?
Michigan State is a singular story. Again, because what happened in the 1960s is not understood very well, Minnesota won a national title in 1960 with 5 black players, only 5. But people don't understand there were only 5. Minnesota gets credit for being a college football integration leader when they were one of the schools following the quota. Illinois had some black stars throughout the 60s. In fact, Jesse Jackson was a great high school athlete in Greenville, South Carolina, and he originally started his college career at Illinois in football. He ended up transferring back to North Carolina A&T, where he graduated. But because they had prominent black stars, if you have a couple of black guys scoring your touchdowns, like O.J. Simpson, then people think, oh, they must have a lot of black players. They did not. It wasn't until Duffy Daugherty had the first fully integrated rosters in the 60s, and the 1966 sixth game of the century brought it into focus on TV that people saw the difference.
So just rounding up, what would you say are the key points that made the big changes?
The Duffy Daugherty abandoned the unwritten quota. He had fully integrated teams. They were successful playing before large TV audiences. The Rose Bowl, which was played on January 1st, 1966, to cap the 1965 season, and then the game of the century on November 19th, 1966. So their story was spread on TV, if not properly spread in the newspapers and magazines. So there was a gradual step by everything in America happened step by step with race. We don't do anything overnight. And so this was traveling parallel tracks to the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King. And there were policies being put in place in America to make us live up to the Declaration of Independence, that everybody was created equal and equal opportunity. And so these things are all just dovetailed together by the end of the decade. But mostly it was Michigan State leading the way as a singular story and down parallel tracks to the civil rights movement. Because if the civil rights movement wasn't going on, no one would have paid attention to what Michigan State was doing. If Michigan State wasn't winning and Duffy Daugherty wasn't courageous enough to abandon the unwritten quotas, then Michigan State wouldn't have been expanding its rosters into fully integrated rosters that other schools began to copy. They broke down the barriers.
Yeah,
You could have black and white kids in the locker room and they wouldn't fight. They'd be friends. You could have a black quarterback and the white players would follow their leadership. Once people get together and get to know each other, you break down barriers.
that's true. It is, without a shadow of a doubt. That's always been the truth. Lastly, actually, just could you just say the 3 books again that you've written?
The first, people can go to my website,
Yeah.
which is tomshanahan.report. And the books are Ray of Light, Jimmy Raye, Duffy Daugherty, The Integration of College Football, and the 1965-66 Michigan State Spartans. The second book is The Right Thing to Do, The True Pioneers of College Football Integration in the 1960s. And then the children's book is Bubba's Dad, Duffy, and College Football's Underground Railroad. And these books are all on my website, but you can also go to Amazon and find them.
Cool. My last question, and it's just an indulgence of imagination. If you could go back in anywhere in history, but I'm going to ask you particularly about a football game. It has to be a game you've never seen. Which game would you like to go back and watch live?
For American football,
Yeah,
uh, well, could I change gears to a different sport?
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would probably say Jackie Robinson's first game when he broke the Major League Baseball color line in 1947. Uh, he didn't really have TV back then. There are a
Mhm.
few video clips, but that would be the game I would want to watch. And the reason I say that is because very similar to what I've told you about Michigan State and
Yeah.
college football integration progress not properly documented. The game with Jackie Robinson, the media hardly wrote about it at all. Dick Young was one famous sports writer ahead of his time, and he was a young writer. He wrote about Jackie Robinson and asked him about the pressure he was facing. But for the most part, this was not the banner headline in the papers. First black player in Major League Baseball. The storyline stuck to the game and the result. There might be a mention, and it just was not recovered and reported that way. And now we look back on it, we celebrate it like America woke up overnight. That's not what happened. Jackie Robinson, if you've watched any of the movies, he had to endure a lot of abuse, similar to the stories I told you about the first black players in the South. He encountered racism for a long time, and in fact, that was the deal Jackie Robinson had with Branch Rickey, the Dodgers general manager, that he would not fight back when he got the cheap shots. Because if he did, then you'd have all the bigots say, see, we can't have black and white athletes playing together. We have to end this experiment. This is where all the 1960s pioneers in the South deserve credit they don't get. Jerry Levias did not fight back. He just, if he had fought back and touched off a riot, then people would have been justified to say, see, can't have integration. That's the end of this. So that these are truly heroic people, and they're on a level with Jackie Robinson.
Perfect. That's a wonderful place to stop. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, thank you for having me, and hope I educated a few people about American sports and college football integration. Don't believe the stories about Bear Bryant.
And there you go. There was Tom. And please check out the description for the links to all his books and his website. And take on board the messages. We have this strange history. It's far from perfect. It's not going to be perfect moving forward. And partly because we don't even know what perfection is. We can't agree on it. Whilst everyone says we should all just get along, we all have definitions of what getting along with each other is. So for my part, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And as always, wherever you are from, whatever you believe, please do take care and be blessed. Thank you.